Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Hugh Freeze, the Auburn Tigers, entering fall camp, and we got a lot of storylines to talk about as we kick off fall camp heading into 2025. I think most notably, or at least what excites me the most, true freshmen on the defensive side of the football starting to stand out. Kind of pegged as a potential difference maker for Auburn in 2025. And look, this is a football player that when you look at Auburn on defense, you kind of feel like needs to break out going into 2025. We got some more news, you might say, on Malcolm Simmons with the team entering fall camp. Look, regardless of how you want to talk about the off the field stuff, we'll focus on talking about it on the field. Malcolm Simmons, one of the more dynamic players that Auburn has on offense going into 2025. I want to start with this before we get nitty gritty. And I get this is now I feel like I'm getting up here and giving coach speak to you guys. That's not my intention, but it's something that we've talked about throughout the offseason with Auburn. The vibe is different for Hugh Freeze going into the 2025 year. How he talks to the media, I think it's very clear that there's a lot of confidence with how this roster has been built over the last couple of years. And look, I look at this Auburn roster and say it's the most talented roster we have seen at Auburn in a very, very long time. We've been saying it all offseason. They have the firepower on this roster to bang with anybody in the country. This would be a question to the Auburn fans. Like, when's the last time you've had as much confidence with what you see on paper from a roster standpoint than what we have with this team going into 2025? That's where you start. But I think the second thing that's very apparent is a little bit more of a clear picture in terms of what this team is going into 2025. And what I mean by that is go back to 2023, even really in 2024 as well, but more importantly in 2023, Hugh Freeze enters fall camp saying, we got to spend most of fall camp trying to figure out who's going to play for us, what our depth chart looks like, who are the difference makers, and who are the guys that we can count on. Now going into 2025, you know what that is. You know who your best players are. You kind of know what your two deep looks like. You have a coaching staff that's pretty much all returning as well. There's a lot more continuity in this program from a coaching staff standpoint and from a personnel standpoint, which allows Auburn to enter fall camp focused on just getting better at the sport. Like, hey, we don't have to figure out what our depth chart's going to look like. We don't have to figure out what players that we can count on in 2025. Now we're just focused on, hey, we know everything about our team. Now we're getting into how can we just get better at football during fall camp. And that's what fall camp's really for. Ideally, you're not trying to figure out what your roster is going to look like, and you're just focused on getting better. Auburn has finally gotten to the point where they're going into fall camp, and I think the focus is let's just get better and let's maximize the talent that we have on this roster. And look, if Auburn does do that, they maximize what we see on paper, this team's going to be a lot more dangerous than people expect in 2025. That's how I want to start. I know that's a little bit coach speak, but I do think that's the vibe that I've had about Auburn. And I thought that was pretty clear when Hugh Freeze was talking to the media this morning. It's kind of the vibe that he has around this program as well. Want to get a little bit more nitty gritty. Before we do, and as always, the Auburn fans, appreciate you guys. Number one, it's been really fun talking this football team for the last 24 months. All the commitments that we have broken down, it kind of leads up to 2025, and you're hoping it pays off on the football field. It's going to be a really fun team to talk about in fall camp, especially starting out the 2025 year. We can't thank you guys enough. There's been a ton of support from y'all. Appreciate it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into it. Now, let's start with Malcolm Simmons back with the team. Now, y'all know Malcolm Simmons as a football player. I think the world of him. I think he's a difference maker. And here's what I think Malcolm Simmons brings to Auburn. And here's why I think he's so important going into 2025. The spacing for this offense is going to be a little bit different. When you have a guy like Cam Coleman and you have a guy like Eric Singleton, you have a guy like Perry Thompson, guys who are really good at working vertically down the field, defenses are going to have to respect that. If you don't leave your two safeties high against Auburn, you're probably going to get beat vertically down the field by a guy like Eric Singleton, by a guy like Cam Coleman. The last couple of years, especially going back to 2023, Auburn couldn't say that. They saw a lot of safeties coming into the box. They saw a lot of defenses squeezing down on them because they didn't have the difference makers vertically. Now that you do have that in 2025, what does that create for Malcolm Simmons? Creates a lot of space underneath those short intermediate route trees. The value that Malcolm Simmons brings is, hey, is he the best route running wide receiver that we have on this football team? No, probably not. Is he outside of Eric Singleton? Probably the most dynamic athlete on the offensive side of the football when he has the football in his hands. Yes, absolutely. And look, he's going to have a lot of space to operate in those short underneath route trees when you have guys like Cam Coleman and Eric Singleton working vertically on the outside. Auburn's full goal is, hey, how can we get Jackson Arnold? Can we get a swagger back? How can we get him settled in a way that we did not see him get settled in at Oklahoma? Well, some easy throws to the outside to a guy like Malcolm Simmons and letting Malcolm Simmons do the rest as an athlete after the catch. That's one way that you can get Jackson Arnold a little bit more settled in with this Auburn offense. Malcolm Simmons, although not the pure best wide receiver on this football team, going to play a really big role in terms of what he can do after the catch, and having him back, you can't really question how much. You can't question the impact that he's going to have on Auburn in 2025. Go back to his freshman year. Hugh Freeze was scheming it around Malcolm Simmons. Like, there were plays that were designed to get Malcolm Simmons the football in his hands. That tells us this coaching staff likes him as a football player. The other thing Hugh Freeze said in his press conference talking to the media that I liked a lot, or at least appreciated. Look, this year he kind of recognized that over the last 2 years was probably trying to do a little too much. Going into 2025, you do not have to try to do too much on offense. And what I mean by that is you got the players. You can line up and go play football. I mean, I don't blame Hugh Freeze for trying to do too much in 2023 when you had Peyton Thorne at quarterback and your best pass catcher was Rivaldo Fairweather. You kind of have to try to win with a little bit of scheme because you don't have the difference makers on offense. Going into 2025, look, we don't have to try to beat teams by out scheming them. We can, and we know Hugh Freeze can scheme it up. But we don't have to rely on scheme. Can play a little bit more simple, can play a little bit more fast, and just let our playmakers go out and make plays. From an offensive skill perspective, there's not many teams, not only in the SEC, but in the country, that match the firepower that Auburn brings to the table on offense, and that feel of, hey, we don't have to try to overcomplicate things. We don't have to try to win with scheme because we have the Jimmies and Joes. That matters for Auburn going into 2025. Last thing that really caught my eye is the conversation around Elijah Melendez. Now, we spent a lot of time in the spring talking about the emergence of Jordan Crawford on the inside as a true freshman. And look, I think he's massively important to Auburn because you look at Auburn and say, hey, we were concerned about the depth, how many bodies we could trust in the middle of that defensive line. Well, hearing all the things that we heard about Jordan Crawford, probably a guy that you can rely on to play 20, 25 snaps a game, massively answers a little bit of our question about, are we deep enough in 2025? Elijah Melendez, I think one of the maybe knocks you could have at Auburn is I don't really doubt the talent in the room, especially with a guy like DeMarcus Riddick. How many linebackers can we trust is probably a little bit of a question. Look, Elijah Melendez emerging as a guy Auburn can count on, that's massive. Because very similar to the conversation we had last year with DeMarcus Riddick, I'll say the same thing with Elijah Melendez. This kid's really big, he's really fast, and he's a striker. Now go turn on some of his high school film. Plays with his hair on fire. Extremely physical at the point of attack, has a ton of range at the linebacker position going sideline to sideline, can run, chase, and tackle. We knew that he had all the physical ability to step on the football field as an 18-year-old kid and play. We weren't really sure what it was between the years. Like, what's the run fit looking like? Do we know how to drop back in coverage? Do we know our responsibilities at the linebacker position? That's a position where, look, if you're a freshman coming off the edge like a Jarrett Smith, you don't have to have a ton of grasp of the defense to get on the football field. Hey, Jared Smith, it's 3rd and 8. Pin your ears back, go get after the quarterback. That's your only job. All right, well, that's a little bit easy. Ain't that complicated for a guy like Jared Smith to get on the football field? Well, when you're Elijah Melendez playing off-ball backer, hey, what gap are you responsibly fitting in the run? If it's play action, we got to drop in coverage. Where's the zone and how much depth do we have to grab on our zone drops. A little bit more that's on your plate at linebacker. And to hear that Elijah Melendez seems like a guy that Auburn can count on at that back position. Look, DeMarcus Riddick and Elijah Melendez, I know it's young, and I'm not like discounting Caleb Wheatland, who adds a very crucial bit of veteran presence in that room. DeMarcus Riddick and Elijah Melendez, that's some juice at the off-ball linebacker position. That's catching my eye a lot. There's a lot of competition on the defensive side of the football. Kind of going back to what we said on offense. Look, you return DJ Durkin, who I thought did a tremendous job with Auburn last year. You're returning a lot on the defensive side of the football. We are not going into fall camp trying to figure out who our difference makers are. We're running it back. Now it's about building on what you did in 2024. And if Auburn builds on what they did in 2024, you're looking at top 15, maybe even top 10 defense if things go Auburn's way. Elijah Melendez, guy that we will be monitoring in fall camp 100%. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. We'll talk to y'all later.